Hi friends! Tonight, we begin a slow and dreamy journey back through the mists of time to the winding streets of Renaissance Florence in the year 1495. You were born here, in this place of beauty and danger, just as a strange and terrifying illness begins its quiet creep across Europe. As candles flicker and whispers echo beneath cathedral arches, your life is only just beginning. And so we begin our story, part by part, with calm footsteps into a world long gone. The year is 1495, and the bells of Santa Maria del Fiore toll a deep somber note over the rooftops of Florence. The sky above the red-bricked dome is a soft, overcast grey, the kind that settles gently over the city without the menace of thunder. The sound of the bell echoes like a heartbeat through narrow, cobbled streets, slipping between ochre buildings and quiet cloisters, brushing across the river Arno with a hush that feels almost sacred. Florence, the jewel of Tuscany, is alive, with colour and culture, its soul steeped in art and its walls echoing with the footfalls of merchants, scholars, and weavers. It is a city that breathes through its frescoes, that whispers in the shadow of its chapels, where the hands of men like Botticelli and Da Vinci still linger in pigment and stone, and in a small, wax-scented workshop tucked behind the bustling Mercato Vecchio, you are born. Your name is Matteo. The midwife whispered it 3 times as you took your first breath. Matteo, 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 as if anchoring you to this world with each syllable. Your mother, Isabetta, was a woman of gentle voice and rosemary-sweet hands. She bore you in the early evening, when the air was cool and the smell of rain mingled with the smoke from hearths. Your father, Girolamo, a stonecutter by trade, was silent during your birth, his large hands gripping a rosary carved from olive wood. You would come to know the world slowly, as all children do, first by light, flickering candlelight, sunlight, warming terracotta floors, then by sound, your mother's lullabies, the distant hymns of monks, the soft sweep of brooms across the church steps, and then by scent, lavender soap, the sharp tang of lemon peel, the ever-present earthy musk of beeswax. In these early years, Florence was a city divided. By day, it rejoiced in its learning. By night, it trembled with uncertainty. There were whispers, as there always are. Rumours drifted like smoke through the marketplace, carried on the voices of travelling merchants and nervous apothecaries. They say it came from the south. A woman in a blue shawl muttered at the olive stall. Naples first, some foreign. Soldier? French? Maybe Spanish? No, said another. It was the sailors, the ones who drink with the whores in the port towns. They call it the French disease, an older man said, spitting into the dirt. But I say it's a punishment, for pride, for sin. It was called the pox, the great pox. But to you, Matteo, none of that mattered. At 3 years old, your world was no larger than your father's shadow and your mother's embrace. You played with scraps of cloth and tiny carved figurines. You listened to your mother sing songs from her childhood, tales of holy saints and weeping angels. You laughed when the pigeons cooed from the rooftop and cried when thunder rattled the windows. Still, the city around you changed. When you were 5, the bells began to ring more often, not for mass, but for mourning. The streets near the monastery were washed daily with vinegar. In the alleys of the San Lorenzo district, people left herbs hanging above their doors, sage, lavender, garlic tied with string, as a ward against illness. Your mother began to speak of saints more than usual. One evening, she lit 3 candles in the window and told you softly, "The light keeps them away, the bad spirits, the sick air." You believed her. Your father grew quieter. He worked longer hours, his hands always stained with white dust from the marble blocks he shaped. When he came home, he rarely spoke, except to hum soft mountain songs from his youth, melodies that curved like the hills of the Apennines. Then, one summer day, you noticed something strange. Tommaso, The boy who lived across the street stopped playing with his hoop. His mother, usually seen at the well, no longer came outside. A day later, the family's door was marked with white chalk, and then, just like that, they were gone. They went to stay with family in the country, someone said. But the air felt heavy. You could feel the fear settle, even as a child. At 6, you began helping your father in his workshop. He taught you how to hold the chisel, how to polish the stone until it gleamed like the moon. You carved simple shapes, leaves, stars, the curve of a shell. And he nodded with pride. Sometimes he whispered prayers while he worked. The stone listens, Matteo, he said one morning. It remembers, and through it all, your mother never stopped singing, even as more doors were marked, even as more streets emptied. She still gathered rosemary, she still ground cloves into tea, and each night she kissed your brow and told you stories of Saint Michael the Protector. Life, though touched by shadows, carried on. The apothecaries grew busy. They ran low on quicksilver. Physicians scribbled notes and argued in courtyards about the humours, about bile and blood. Some prescribed mercury, others leeches. A few simply offered wine and hope, and you, little Matteo, you watched. You watched the world change. You saw people wear masks soaked in vinegar. You saw friars lead processions through the city, barefoot, chanting for mercy. You saw old men beg at the church steps, their hands shaking with more than age. But even in fear, there was warmth. There was still bread on the table. There was still laughter, soft and quiet. There were still stars above the rooftops. The bell tolled in Firenze, not just for death, but for life that continued, stubborn and tender. And your story, dear listener, was only beginning. The morning sun filtered through the shutters like a golden whisper, casting faint lines upon the waxed wooden floor. You awoke to the gentle creak of the ceiling beams above, and the scent of something sweet, maybe apples warmed over embers, or cinnamon steeping in a pot. Your mother hummed softly downstairs, and from the narrow street outside, the distant bray of a donkey told you that the market was stirring again. Florence was alive, but differently now. You rose and wrapped a woolen shawl around your shoulders. Your feet, still bare and small, pattered over the cool floor. The house was quiet in that serene way only morning can be, when all is promise and potential, and even fear seems to sleep. But as you stepped outside, blinking against the light, you saw the difference in the air. There was no laughter in the street. The baker's window, once fogged with heat and scent, was closed. The door to the cobbler's shop hung slightly ajar, swaying with the breeze, but no hammer struck inside. A ribbon of silence ran down the length of your street, and you felt it wrap around your ankles like a ribbon of cold water. Your father had gone early to the cathedral, where new statues were being commissioned, stone saints to guard against sickness. Your mother sent you to deliver a pouch of lavender to the herbalist, an old woman named Annetta who lived 2 streets away, near the convent of Santa Verdiana. You hesitated. That street was narrow and dark, lined with tall buildings that leaned together like gossiping sisters. It was called Via del Ombre, the Street of Shadows. You had never liked it, but your mother, gentle and firm, placed the pouch in your hand and kissed your cheek. "It is only a street," she said, "and lavender brings calm." So you went. The sun could not reach that alley. It stretched above you like a tunnel, muffled and still. Shutters were drawn tightly shut, and cloth banners hung between balconies to dry, though no one moved them. You counted the steps to keep your courage. 1, 2, 3, 4. The stones beneath your feet were slick, worn smooth by centuries, and then, halfway down the lane, you saw something. A doll. It sat on the edge of a stair, leaning awkwardly, one wooden eye missing. Its dress was faded blue, and its small hands had been carved with care. You crouched, heart fluttering, and gently touched its sleeve. Children had lived here once, Laughter had echoed through this alley. Feet had chased one another. Games had been played, secrets whispered, sweets shared. But now, all that remained was the doll. You looked up and saw a door marked with chalk, white, smeared, but still visible, and beside it, a scrap of cloth tied to the handle. Your heart stilled. You had seen that mark before. It meant quarantine. It meant someone inside was ill, perhaps gone. Quickly, quietly, you stood and walked on. When you reached Annetta's door, you knocked 3 times as your mother taught you, soft but sure. The old woman opened it with a long, tired sigh. She wore a scarf over her nose and mouth, and her eyes were pale as stone. She took the lavender and said nothing, only nodded. Before she closed the door, she placed a small pouch in your hand, dried lemon peel and cloves, tied with twine. "For your mother," she whispered. "Tell her to boil it, drink it, burn the steam." You nodded. "Grazie." And then you turned and walked back through the street of shadows. The world was changing. You saw it in the boarded windows, the silence that lingered too long, the way people crossed themselves, even when no priest was near. You saw it in the way pigeons gathered on rooftops, as if waiting for something to end. But you also saw kindness. You saw it in Annetta's eyes, in her quiet gift. You saw it in the way your father still shaped wings into stone, even as the world feared death. You saw it in your mother's steady voice, in the way she left extra bread near the convent door for the sisters who now tended the sick. And that night, as you returned home, you sat by the window and watched the stars blink above the city. The sky was still the same, vast, endless, indifferent. But it comforted you. Even the pox could not touch the stars. Your mother steeped the cloves that night. The scent filled the room like warmth. And your father came home late, hands coated in marble dust, eyes weary but full. He knelt beside you and unwrapped a small bundle of cloth. Inside was a figurine, an angel carved from white stone. "For you," he said, "to watch your dreams." You held it close, and as sleep pulled at your eyes, you whispered to yourself, not in fear, but in hope. The city was silent, yes, but shadows were not all that lived in the dark. Sometimes there were stars. The moon rose full that week, round and milky above the city's red roofs, and people began to call it the Plague Moon. It was not a name spoken in daylight. No priest gave it voice in sermons, no physician scribbled it into notes. But in alleys, over bread crusts, and behind tightly drawn curtains, the name passed from mouth to mouth like a charm or a curse. "The moon is watching," old women said, crossing themselves. "It sees who has been touched." The air had grown cooler, even, though summer was not yet done. Wind moved in slow, strange patterns, as if it too had changed its course. Smoke curled downward instead of rising. Dogs howled at odd hours, and cats vanished from their favoured windows. In the evenings, your family gathered in the candlelight. It was the only time the world felt normal. Your mother would hum as she spun wool, the wheel clicking softly in. Rhythm. Your father sat nearby, sharpening his chisels and humming low, earthy songs, melodies older than any book, and you, little Matteo, held your angel figurine and listened. There were fewer customers now. No one wanted statues unless they were saints or gravestones. Your father worked mainly for the churches, and even they were slow to pay. He did not complain. He never had, but you saw it in his eyes. That quiet weight that fathers carry and never name. Still, your mother smiled, and still she sang. "Why do you sing, Mama?" you asked one night, as the candle sputtered low. "To keep the dark from sitting too, long in our hearts," she replied, placing a hand gently on your hair. "When words fail, songs remain," and so she sang. Old folk songs in the Tuscan dialect, soft and lilting. Songs of harvest, of lost lovers, of saints who walked barefoot across rivers. They did not always make sense to you, but they wrapped around your dreams like warm blankets. One evening, she taught you a lullaby her mother had once sung. You repeated the lines slowly, stumbling at first, then catching the tune. When you reached the final verse, your mother smiled, a smile tinged with something unspoken. "She sang that to me during the famine, when I was a girl," she said. "We had only onions and prayer, but still, she sang." The wind knocked gently at the shutters. That night, you lay in bed and watched the moon through the slats. It hung heavy and still, like a lantern caught on a hook in the sky. You imagined it could see everything: the silent streets, the chalk-marked doors, the friars murmuring in their cloisters, and you imagined it could see you too, a small boy clutching a stone angel and whispering lullabies to the night. In the days that followed, the music began to move beyond your home. One morning, as you passed the church of San Miniato, you heard singing from inside, not solemn chants, but something softer. A boy's voice, high and clear, wove through the open door. You crept closer, heart fluttering, and peeked in. There, in the dim golden light of stained glass, a small choir was practicing. The choirmaster noticed you but said nothing. He merely nodded, and so you sat near the back, beside a pillar, and listened. The Latin was strange to your ears, but the melody, the melody was like water over stone. It calmed something inside you, something that had curled tight since the first time you saw the chalk-marked door. You returned every few days, always listening, never speaking. And slowly, you began to recognize faces. There was Pietro, a freckled boy who sang like the wind on rooftops. Clara, a girl with braids as long as her back, whose voice trembled like candlelight. And there was Brother Leone, the choirmaster, whose hands moved like wings as he led them. One day, he approached you. "You listen with your whole self," he said. "That's rarer than you think." You flushed and looked down. "I don't know the words." "That can be learned," he said, placing a hand on your shoulder. "But listening, that is a gift." He invited you to sit closer next time, and so you did. Music, you discovered, was a language that illness could not silence. Outside, the city faltered. Another house boarded. Another funeral bell. Apothecaries now posted prices on doors because they could no longer speak to each visitor. But inside that quiet chapel, voices rose like morning sun. You began to sing, not loudly, not yet with confidence, but you joined the others in the low notes, then the high. You practiced the Latin at home, your mother helping you sound out the words, and your father carved a new figurine, a boy with hands lifted in song. He gave it to you without a word. The moon waned, but people still spoke of it. Some said it was red on certain nights, a blood moon. Others said it never moved, only watched. But your mother said something different. "The moon has always seen us," she whispered. "It saw Rome fall. It saw floods and wars. And it sees us now. But it has never stopped shining." You remembered that, especially when the next chalk mark appeared, this time on the herbalist's door. Annetta. You watched as the sisters from the convent came to take her. They wore veils soaked in vinegar and sang prayers as they walked. There was no scream, no sound at all. And that night, you sang your lullaby louder. For her, for the city, for yourself. The stars blinked gently overhead, and you felt, deep in your small, beating heart, that the songs would outlive the sickness, that one day someone else might remember the tune, and that was enough. In the heart of Florence, where the lanes narrowed and the air smelled of ash and olive oil, your father worked among the stones. Girolamo was not a loud man. He did not tell stories or recite verses as your mother did. He did not sing, except under his breath, but he had hands that spoke, rough and thick, shaped by years of chisel and mallet, by dust and divine detail. He worked in the shadow of the Duomo, beneath the vast red dome that seemed to shelter the entire city. The workshop was near the bell tower, where the sky split into slices through leaded windows. Dust danced constantly in the beams of light, golden motes moving as though each carried a soul. As the pox deepened its hold on the city, statues were in greater demand than ever. Not the kind for fountains or noble halls, but saints. Saint Sebastian, pierced with arrows, became the most sought after. Then Saint Roch, the healer, and always, always, the Madonna. Pale-faced, hands open in sorrow or grace. Your father never complained. He arrived early before the sun crested the hills. He carved until his wrists ached and his knees stiffened. Sometimes you came with him, sitting near the back with your angel figurine, watching in silence. You loved the sound of the chisel, sharp, precise, like a whisper between worlds. One day, he placed a lump of marble in front of you. For your hands, he said simply. You blinked, unsure. Me, he nodded. Even the smallest hand leaves shape. And so you began. Small at first. Awkward. You tried carving a leaf, but the stem broke. Then a star, but the lines wouldn't meet. Your father said nothing, only handed you a smoother stone. Again. Days passed, then weeks, and you learned to shape without rushing, to let the stone guide you. You cannot force what wants to remain hidden, he said once. You can only invite it out. That lesson stayed with you. One afternoon, after many tries, you carved a hand. Just a small one, fingers curled slightly, palm soft. Your father took it, turned it gently in his large hands, and for the first time, smiled with pride. Good, he said. That's the beginning. And it was. Outside, the city changed more quickly than stone ever could. The pox spread like a breath across rooftops. Markets thinned, music dulled, processions grew longer, always silent, always cloaked. But in the workshop, saints continued to rise from marble. One by one, your father shaped them. Not grand or ostentatious, no gold, no paint, just clean lines, solemn eyes, and the weary grace of those who watch the world without judgment. He taught you the names: Saint Apollonia, who bore her suffering in silence; Saint Lucy, her eyes shining with vision no blade could take; Saint Agatha, whose wounds became symbols of healing. These were people, your father said once, not myths. They wept and bled and doubted just like us. But why make them, you asked? If they're gone, he looked at the stone in his hand, the half-formed face of St. Catherine. Because grief needs a place to rest, he said. And stone remembers longer than flesh. That night, you couldn't sleep. You lay awake thinking of statues. How they stood unmoving while everything else changed. You thought of Annetta's chalked door, of the boy with freckles who no longer came to choir, of the moon that had no answers. And then, softly, you understood what your father meant. You began to watch him more closely, how he held each chisel like a feather, how he bowed his head before each figure, how he whispered sometimes, as if in prayer. There was holiness in his labour, even if no church claimed it. Once, as he shaped the folds of St. Francis's robe, he said, "Every chip of stone is like a word left unsaid, but together they speak." You wrote that line down on a scrap of parchment and hid it beneath your angel. By midsummer, your own hands were calloused. You had carved not just hands and stars, but now eyes, simple ones, oval and closed, as if, sleeping, your father kept one, placing it in a niche above the door. A dream watcher, he called it. One morning, you arrived to the workshop and found your father speaking with a priest. Not one from your local parish, but a visiting Dominican. He spoke of a commission for a full Madonna, life-sized, for a chapel outside the city where many had gone to pray for mercy. Your father agreed, though his eyes showed the strain. You watched him work on her for weeks, slowly, patiently. He began with her feet, bare, resting on a crescent moon. Then her robes, flowing like water frozen mid-fall. Finally her face, serene, sorrowful, eyes downcast, as though witnessing all the world's pain. When it was done, he did not speak. He only sat beside her, breathing slowly. You approached, touched her hand. It was smooth, perfect. She's not looking at anything, you said softly. No, he answered. She's remembering. The Madonna was transported with reverence. It took 5 men to lift her. As they carried her through the street, people stopped. Some crossed themselves. Others wept. One woman followed the entire procession barefoot. Your mother stood beside you, holding your hand. Your father's heart lives in that stone, she said, and you understood. In a world where breath could vanish overnight, where names could fade as quickly as chalk in the rain, the saints in stone endured. They could not save, perhaps, but they could stand. And sometimes that was enough. The scent of vinegar became part of your home. It clung to the shutters, soaked into linens, and hovered in the doorway like an invisible guardian. Your mother had taken to boiling it with rosemary and cloves, the steam rising in soft white ribbons that curled around the ceiling beams and drifted down again like quiet snow. She said it kept the sickness away. In every corner of Florence, people found ways to believe. Bundles of garlic hung beside crucifixes. Basil sprigs were tucked under pillows. Coins were soaked in lemon water before changing hands. And all the while, bells tolled, not just for the dead, but to mark hours of prayer, as if rhythm alone might preserve the city. Your mother called these daily moments her vespers, not just the evening prayers, but every act of care she repeated to protect you and your father. She lit candles at dawn. She wiped every handle with cloths dipped in vinegar. She whispered saints' names beneath her breath, over and over, like beads on a rosary, and she taught you to do the same. Faith, she told you one morning as she ground dried sage into powder, is not only belief in God, it is belief that your hands can make a difference. You watched her press the powder into wax pellets, shaping them with care. We burned these when my mother coughed, she said. It makes the air sweeter. Spirits do not like sweet air. The city had begun to dim, not in light, but in spirit. Shopkeepers no longer called to one another in the mornings. The fountain, in the central square, once a place of laughter and gossip, now ran with silence. People kept to their homes, their eyes flickering out from behind shutters like moths against glass. But within your house, the rituals continued. Each day was a procession of small duties. Your father carved. You shaped small figurines, your touch, more certain now. And your mother, she preserved herbs, baked dark bread, and sang under her breath. Her voice was not always steady, but she sang. It was during one such afternoon, as steam from a fresh batch of vinegar herbs rose around her, that you noticed something strange. Your mother sat by the hearth, her hands resting in her lap. The bowl beside her was untouched. Her eyes were fixed on the flames, but they did not move. "Mama?" you asked. She blinked, then smiled, but it was slow, like a candle catching late. "I was remembering," she said, voice distant. "My sister. She died during the cough plague, long ago, before you were born. She used to brush my hair and sing to the walls when no one listened. You moved closer. Did she sing lullabies too?" She nodded. "Yes, but her favourite was a song about swallows. She believed they carried messages between the living and the dead." You sat beside her quietly. The fire crackled, and the scent of rosemary hung sweet and strong. "Do you think people come back after they die?" you asked softly. She didn't answer right away. She took your hand instead, her fingers cool and gentle. "I think they stay in what they leave behind," she whispered. "In songs, in smells, in habits, in how we love." And then she smiled, truly smiled. "Now, help me with the oranges." Oranges were precious. They had become rare in the markets, especially the bitter ones. But somehow your mother had bartered for two. She sliced them thin and laid them on a tray beside bay leaves, then placed the tray on a stool by the fire. "Chat, smell chases fear," she said, though her eyes shimmered. That night, you sat by the window again, holding your stone angel. The streets below glimmered faintly in torchlight. Far off, you heard the murmur of monks in procession. No bells, no chants, just soft footfalls and the occasional clink of rosaries. It was the third vigil that week. You counted their lanterns as they passed. 13. Then silence. Later, your father returned from the cathedral, his cloak carrying the scent of plaster and wet marble. He set down his satchel and looked at the oranges. "She burned them," you said, "to chase fear." He raised an eyebrow and smiled gently. "Did it work?" You thought for a moment. "I think it helped her remember." Your father didn't speak, but he looked at your mother for a long while. She had fallen asleep in the chair, one hand curled around her rosary, the other resting lightly on her apron. In the flickering hearthlight, her face looked younger, softer, like a girl again. He stepped over and placed a blanket across her lap. Then he turned to you. "You must learn to see the shape of things, Matteo," he said. "Not just in stone, but in people, in how they carry weight." You nodded, though the meaning unfolded only slowly. That night, before sleep, you did your own ritual. You dipped a cloth in vinegar and wiped the wooden frame of your bed. You placed your angel by your pillow. And you whispered the names of the saints your mother had taught you, even the ones you didn't fully understand. Outside, the wind sighed through the cracks in the shutters, and you imagined the swallows, dark silhouettes beneath the moon, carrying quiet messages from the hearts of those who had loved and lost. If the sickness returned again in your dreams, you would be ready. You had vespers now, and vinegar, and the lullaby of a mother who remembered. It was before dawn when your father woke you. His shadow moved like a quiet ship through the dim house, and his hand on your shoulder was warm, steady. Outside, the sky had not yet shifted from black to blue. The stars still clung stubbornly to their corners of the heavens. "Come," he whispered. "Dress warm." There was no need to ask where. You had overheard his conversation the night before. A priest from the hills had come with coin and gratitude, seeking a Madonna statue for a chapel far beyond the city walls. A place where people gathered not for healing, but for remembrance. You, dressed in silence, wrapping your cloak tight. Your mother packed a satchel of bread, pears, and one of the precious orange peels. She kissed your forehead twice, once for love, once for luck. Then you stepped into the night. The streets were empty, save for the low flicker of lanterns hung on posts and the occasional creak of a shutter touched by wind. Your father led a small cart drawn by a donkey, covered with linen and bound in rope. Beneath it, you knew, lay the statue, his Madonna, carved with care over many weeks. Her eyes were downturned in prayer, her robe soft with folds of stone, as you left the city gates. The air changed. It grew colder, crisper, the wind untroubled by chimney smoke or human breath. Cypress trees lined the road like quiet sentinels, their shapes stark against the moonlight. You passed farmhouses, some dark, some dimly lit, and shrines at crossroads, where candles burned behind cracked glass. At last, just as the sky began to blush with early morning, you reached the chapel. It was small, humble, built from riverstone and capped with red tile. A wooden door leaned on crooked hinges, and above it hung a carved image of St. Sebastian, faded by sun and rain, but still there, pierced and patient. The priest waited at the entrance. He was tall and pale, with eyes the colour of storm water. He bowed in greeting, then gestured gently toward the chapel. Inside, it smelled of thyme and old wax. Dozens of candles flickered in nooks along the walls. On each side of the nave, benches sagged with age. A few people sat in silence, a woman with her head bowed into her shawl, a man with bandaged fingers clutching a rosary, and two children wrapped in a single woolen blanket. No one spoke. Your father and the priest unwrapped the Madonna with reverence. The linen fell away like mist, revealing her quiet face, her open hands. The priest sighed, a sound somewhere between sorrow and relief. She will watch over them, he said. They placed her behind the altar, where morning light fell through a rose-shaped window. Her face caught the gold, and for a moment she looked alive. Then the priest knelt. Your father followed. You did too. You were not yet certain what prayer meant. Not in full, but you had learned its shapes. The bow of the head, the stillness of the hands, the silence that blooms behind the ribs. You closed your eyes and tried to think not of sickness, but of safety, not of death, but of light. Then, softly, a voice. It was the woman in the shawl. She began to sing, a hymn, old, worn by time. Her voice cracked in places but held. Others joined, the man with bandaged hands, the children, even the priest. Your father did not sing, but his eyes were wet. And you, Matteo, sang in your smallest voice because the song seemed to ask for it. It was not loud, it was not polished, but it filled the chapel like smoke, curling through beams and rafters, rising to where even birds had once perched in the eaves. And when it faded, no one clapped, no one bowed, they simply breathed. The priest stood slowly and turned to your father. This chapel is for those who are not healed, he said. But even they deserve to be seen. Your father nodded. Stone remembers. The priest smiled faintly. So does God. Before you left, you lit a candle with your own hands. Your fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of it all. You did not know who the candle was for. Annetta, perhaps. Or Tommaso. Or maybe for someone you had yet to lose. The flame danced, and you whispered, "Be seen." On the journey home, your father said little. The cart was empty now. The Madonna had found her place. But there was peace in his silence. The sun climbed higher, warming the path. Birds stirred in the trees. The donkey snorted and stepped sure-footed, as if knowing the way without needing to be told. When Florence's walls appeared again in the distance, your father finally spoke. That statue will outlast us, he said. Even if the chapel crumbles, someone will find her. Maybe 100 years from now, maybe longer. She will still be watching. You looked up at him. Do you think she hears the prayers? He thought for a moment. I think, he said, she holds them like water in cupped hands. That image stayed with you. That night, as the sky folded into velvet and the stars returned, you lay in your bed and imagined a chapel full of held prayers, each one glowing faintly like embers. Some were old, some new. Some were soft as lullabies. Some were broken, but all of them were kept. And somewhere in the hills beyond the city, the Madonna watched over them, silent and eternal. She lived at the edge of Florence, where the gardens began to curl into wild hills, and the cobbled paths gave way to gravel and root. Her name was Sister Theodora, not a nun in the true sense, but she wore a simple veil, and her house smelled of earth and memory. People called her La Guaritrice, the healer. Some whispered she had learned from the Saracens. Others said she had the touch of St. Hildegard, but most said nothing at all, only came when all else had failed. You first heard of her from Brother Leone. She heals in silence, he said, as he guided the choir through their morning hymns. Some think her a witch. I think her a mercy. It was late autumn then. The vines along the stone walls had turned to rust and gold, and the air smelled of wood smoke. Florence had settled into its hush, that quiet which illness always brings. But in the midst of it, word spread. Theodora had saved a family from the San Frediano quarter. She used wine and ashes, one woman whispered, burned rue and lavender, and the fever broke. Your mother looked up from her pot of steeped rosemary, her face thoughtful. Wine and ashes, she murmured. That's an old prayer. That evening she asked your father if you could accompany her to visit Theodora. Not for healing, but for understanding. She has seen more than we have, your mother said, and there is comfort in the knowing. Your father hesitated, but finally nodded. Learn carefully. So the next morning, you walked with her. The path wound through fields that had once held lavender and wheat, now brown and brittle. A donkey brayed in the distance, and far off, a boy herded goats, singing to keep the silence away. You walked in step with your mother, her basket swinging gently at her side. Theodora's house was built into a hill. The door was low, arched in stone. Ivy crept along the sides, and bunches of herbs, dry and fragrant, hung in clusters from the eaves. You knocked, and after a pause, the door creaked open. She was older than you expected, not ancient, but worn in the way mountains are, shaped by time and wind. Her eyes were pale grey, like morning fog, and her hands, when she took your mother's in greeting, were calloused and warm. You've come to learn, not to beg, she said softly. That is rare. Your mother bowed her head. I've lost too many without knowing why. Theodora gestured you inside. The room was low-ceilinged and full of jars. Glass, clay, tin, each labelled in a faded hand. You saw lemon balm, nettle, hyssop, feverfew. There were stones wrapped in cloth, tiny bones tied with string, and oils so thick they shimmered like honey. Every illness is a guest, Theodora said. Some come with anger, some with silence, some stay too long. She handed your mother a bundle of dried elderflower. This one cools the blood. When the fever screams, this soothes it. You watched her closely. She moved with a deliberate grace, her fingers never rushing. Every herb she touched, she did so as if greeting an old friend. What about the pox? Your mother asked. Theodora's face darkened, not in fear, but weariness. It is not new, she said, only forgotten. It has other names. In old books, in Arab scrolls it is written. A punishment, yes, but not by God, by men. You were quiet. The room smelled of sage and vinegar. Outside, a raven called from the trees. Theodora turned to you suddenly. Come here, boy, she said. You stepped forward, unsure. She placed something in your hand, a small stone wrapped in cloth, scented with myrrh. Carry this, she said, not because it protects you, but because it reminds you to breathe slowly. You nodded, holding it tight. Later, she showed your mother how to crush dried figs into paste and mix it with crushed garlic and honey for wounds. She demonstrated how to boil water with quince seeds to ease the cough. And she spoke of balance, not just of the humours, but of the spirit. Fear is the fastest sickness, she said. It spreads quicker than breath. Before you left, she gave your mother a small vial of thick brown oil. Rub it on the soles of the feet. It draws heat down. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves skittered along the path, and the sun was caught behind grey clouds. She carries much, your mother said softly as you walked back. I wonder who carries her. You didn't answer. You were thinking of her hands, strong, gentle, stained with the colour of bark and ash. That night, your mother placed the stone beside your bed. It's just a reminder, she said. To breathe slowly, you whispered. She smiled. In your dream, you walked again to the healer's house. But this time, it was filled with candles, each burning, without flame, each humming a different note. Theodora was there, placing a glowing herb into a basin of water. As it touched the surface, the whole room exhaled. You awoke with the scent of sage still in your nose, and outside, the stars were brighter than they had been in weeks. The winter came softly that year, like a woolen blanket drawn over the shoulders of the city. The rooftops of Florence wore a light dusting of snow, delicate and uncertain. The chimneys smoked quietly, and the bells sounded more muffled in the cold air, their chimes swallowed gently by the thickened sky. Even the pigeons on the cathedral ledges moved more slowly, puffed with frost and caution. Inside your home, the hearth burned almost constantly. Your mother brewed broth and warm clove tea. Your father worked less, the stone too brittle in the frost for delicate chiseling. But he repaired tools, polished completed pieces, and mended the small cracks that the cold had revealed. In this stillness, a new practice began to appear across the city. It started quietly, like so much else. First, a folded piece of parchment tucked into the altar rail at the church of Santa Trinita. Then another, pinned to the wooden beam outside the herbalist's boarded-up shop. Then several more, strung with ribbons to the iron fence that ringed the cemetery gate. Letters. Some were prayers, some were confessions. Others were simply words, names, memories, dreams never fulfilled. They called them lettere ai persi, letters to the lost. And soon, they appeared everywhere. People who could not say goodbye now wrote their sorrows instead. They wrote to mothers and sons, to sisters gone silent, to lovers whose names had vanished from parish rolls. They tied them to railings with thread, placed them in bowls of salt, or tucked them into candle wax. You read your first letter on a morning when the fog clung low. It had been pinned to the trunk of a fig tree outside the choir chapel just below. The frozen buds of spring. To my little Agnesa, it read in uneven ink. I found your slipper near the fire. I kept it. The way the toe curls makes me think you are still coming back. Your throat tightened and your eyes stung, though no wind blew. That evening, at home, your mother folded parchment and handed it to you. If you wish, she said, write something. To who? You asked. She touched your shoulder. To anyone who waits for your words. So you sat at the table, candle flickering beside you, and thought of what you might say. You thought of Tommaso, who had vanished, without goodbye. You thought of Annetta, her door marked in chalk, her jars still in your dreams. You thought of the healer Teodora, and the stories she carried like burdens in her hands. But more than anything, you thought of the fear, how it hovered over the city like a bird with no nest, how even the strong, even the joyful, sometimes needed to be heard. You dipped your quill in ink and wrote slowly. I am still here, you began. I still remember your voice. I keep it safe, like a piece of cloth folded beneath the heart. You didn't name anyone. Perhaps you didn't need to. When you were done, your mother smiled and pressed the parchment gently with her palm. The next morning, you walked together to the Ponte Vecchio. There, beneath the central arch, people had begun, tying their letters with twine to the old wooden rails. Some fluttered like birds, others hung heavy, damp with snowmelt. Yours joined them, quietly, without ceremony. You didn't expect anything to change, but something did. You felt lighter, as if some small weight had unhooked from your chest. As the days passed, more letters came, some written in careful Latin, others in broken lines of Tuscan dialect. Children drew pictures of stars and saints. One note simply read, I am trying. And in the evenings, your mother would read one aloud by the fire, not to weep, but to remember. These are stories, she said, even if short, and stories keep us from becoming ghosts to one another. Your father, though quiet, began carving. Smaller saints again. He gave them no names, but you noticed he left space in their hands. Tiny open palms, as if holding something unseen. He gave one to your mother, for what cannot be said, he murmured. Then, one day, a letter came addressed, not to the dead, but to the city itself. Dear Firenze, it began. I still love your bells. I still love the sound of bread being cut in the morning. I still love the rooftops, even when they weep. It was pinned to the statue of St. John near the cathedral steps. People stopped to read it. Some bowed, some smiled, and others added their own. That night, you wrote again. This time, you addressed it to the ones who cannot speak. You wrote of how the wind sometimes carried the scent of figs even in winter, how the stars seemed to hum when no one was watching, how your stone angel still guarded your sleep. I don't know what's next, you wrote, but I am not alone. You signed it only with your first name, Matteo, and tied it to the gate outside the chapel where your father's Madonna stood. The wind lifted it slightly, then let it rest. And somewhere, you imagined, someone else might read it. Someone still here, or someone waiting far beyond. It began with silence. The snow came in the hours just before dawn, falling softly as if from the breath of angels. Not a storm, not a fury, just a quiet, persistent drifting that softened rooftops and settled over the sleeping city like a prayer. It covered cobblestones, cloaked alleyways, and turned chimney smoke into slow, swirling ghosts. By the time the sun began its pale climb over the Tuscan hills, Florence was white. The Arno River, usually green and restless, had stilled its voice. It moved like a slow-glass serpent, edged with frost and whispering against the banks. The bridges, stone-backed and centuries old, wore coats of snow like forgotten kings dressed again for ceremony. You woke to the stillness, not the fearful stillness of sickness or mourning, but something gentler, the kind of silence that holds, a breath, as if waiting for a song to begin. You rose from your bed and pulled back the shutters. And there it was, the city you knew, but unfamiliar in its softness. It snowed, you whispered. Your mother stood beside you. And blessed, us with quiet, the day began differently. The usual sounds, the clanging of church bells, the shouts of market vendors, the rumble of carts, were all softened, wrapped in snow's hush. People moved slower, voices lowered. Even the dogs padded more carefully along the roads. Your father decided not to work. The marble is cold, he said, sipping warm wine. Let the saints wait a day. Instead, he gathered his cloak and suggested a walk. You went with him, the three of you, father, mother, and child, wrapped in scarves and old boots, stepping gently through the streets like pilgrims in a white-painted dream. Your footprints left soft trails behind you, and every now and then, you paused to watch snow fall from an awning or drip in slow tears from a statue's cheek. Near the Ponte Santa Trinita, you stopped. The river looked strange beneath the snow, silent and calm. Along its edge, people had gathered, not in fear, but in reverence. A few children tossed snow into the water, watching it melt like sugar. An old man knelt by the bank, tracing something in the white dust. And farther down the path, a group of monks stood in a circle, their hands clasped, singing a hymn too soft for words. You stepped closer to the edge and watched. The water, dark and gleaming, held the reflection of the sky like a mirror. A single leaf floated along its surface, curled and golden. It drifted with dignity, unhurried. Your mother crouched beside you. In the plague of my youth, she said quietly, we feared the river. We thought it might carry illness, but I remember watching it after the storm, and it looked just like this, as if the world had decided to rest. Your father touched the iron rail. Snow reminds us, he said, that not all silence means death. You nodded, unsure why his words felt so heavy and so kind at once. As you walked farther along the river, you came to a small garden once tended by the Sisters of Santa Trinita. Now it lay empty, the herbs buried beneath white. But someone had left offerings, a sprig of sage, a clay bowl of dried figs, and a wooden carving of St. Francis, half buried in snow. You brushed the snow from its face and smiled. He looks happy, you said. Your father chuckled. He always preferred the animals to the people. Your mother leaned against the old stone wall. Maybe the snow reminds him of heaven. And for a moment, it did feel like heaven. Peaceful, clean, untouched by sorrow. But as the morning gave way to noon, signs of the city's grief returned. Along a row of chestnut trees, someone had placed candles in the snow, each flickering low. Beside one, a letter. You read it in silence. To the mother I never met. I saw your name today, etched in stone. I wish you could have taught me to braid my hair. I hope snow covers your grave. You stood still. Your mother touched your shoulder, and your father lowered his head. It was true. Beauty and sorrow walked hand in hand, even in the snow. You returned home slowly, your hands cold but your heart oddly full. The fire had gone out, but your mother relit it. You set your stone angel near the hearth, letting it warm. And that afternoon, your father carved quietly, not a saint this time, but a river, the first time he had ever shaped water in stone. It curved delicately across the marble, with small ripples carved in careful rhythm, and at its center, a leaf. You watched him work. When he finished, he said, "We forget sometimes that water remembers too." That evening, as the snow began to melt from the rooftops, your mother sat with you near the window. She handed you parchment, and once again, you wrote. This time, your words were fewer. To the ones beneath the river, you wrote, "We walked today and remembered. We saw the leaf and the snow and the monks, and we didn't forget you. You signed it, from the boy with the angel, and you left it on the bridge that night, tucked between the stones. The snow glimmered faintly around it, like stars fallen from heaven, and the Arno carried on, not loudly, but surely. They came at twilight, when the sky burned amber behind the hills, and the last light of the sun bent gently across the rooftops. First, a sound, the soft rhythm of footsteps, not hurried, not loud, just steady, measured. Then the flicker of lanterns, dozens of them, swaying with the motion of hands and breath. At first, you thought it a dream, but when you stepped onto the small balcony with your mother, you saw them clearly. The pilgrims. They walked in pairs or small groups, some barefoot, some cloaked in simple wool robes. Each one carried a lantern, the glass smudged with soot, the flame inside trembling with each step. They did not speak. They did not look up. They moved like a river of light, flowing through the street below with a reverence that stilled even the dogs. "Where are they going?" you whispered. "To the Chapel of Seven Sorrows," your mother replied. "Outside the San Nicolo gate." You had heard of that chapel, small, ancient, carved into the side of a hill, where the stones bled with rain in winter and the prayers clung to the walls like moss. It was said to house relics, splinters of wood perhaps, or cloth touched by a saint's tears. But more than that, it was known for one thing: mercy. "They walk to be forgiven?" you asked. "Some," your mother said. "Others walk to be remembered." That night, the pilgrims' lights stayed with you. Even long after they had vanished into the darkness beyond the Arno, you imagined their lanterns moving, glowing points of warmth against the cold night. The next morning, Florence was hushed again, as if the earth itself was listening. At the market, people spoke of the procession with quiet awe. "They came from the south," said the olive seller. "Walked for weeks." "No, they were from Siena," argued another. "Their bishop sent them to ask the Madonna's favour." Your father, who rarely entered such conversations, only said, "They carried light. That's enough." Later that week, more pilgrims came. Not in the same numbers, but enough that the city began to change. Inns that had been empty opened their doors with caution. Churches burned incense from dawn to dusk, and small bowls of water, blessed, scented with rose, were placed at thresholds again. Your mother called them hope wells. "They remind us to offer something," she said, "even if it is only water." You asked to see the pilgrims up close. So one afternoon, your father took you to the road beyond the eastern wall, where the travellers often paused before their last steps toward the chapel. The sky was pale blue, the clouds feathered like parchment. You stood beside a row of olive trees and waited, And then you saw them, not saints, not martyrs, just people. A man with a limp, carrying his child on his shoulders. A woman with silver-threaded hair whispering a rosary. Two boys no older than you, guiding their blind grandfather along the stones. They did not speak, but they nodded to those who watched. Their faces were lined, their feet wrapped in linen, their hands holding tight to the cords of their lanterns. You noticed something strange. Many had no glass, just a flame cupped in metal. Some barely flickered in the wind, but still they carried them, as if each light held a soul. "Do they believe they'll be spared?" you asked. Your father watched them pass. "No," he said, "but they believe they will be seen." You held those words. At home, you carved your first lantern in soft soapstone. It was small, simple, with 4 open sides and a circle at its top. You left room inside, empty space, shaped carefully. When you showed it to your father, he turned it in his hand. "What will you put in it?" he asked. "Nothing," you said. "Only light." He nodded slowly. "Then you understand." That evening, you placed it on your windowsill, and inside it, you set a small candle. As dusk fell, you lit the flame and watched it glow against the snow beyond the glass. A signal, a softness, a sign that someone, somewhere, was still awake and still hoping. Others in the neighborhood began to do the same. Lanterns appeared in windows, even where no one had lit a fire in weeks. Some held candles, others were only painted shapes. But the light grew, one window at a time, until the street at night looked almost festive, not in celebration, but in courage. Your mother said it reminded her of her girlhood, when stars were counted as prayers, and children whispered wishes into shoes left on doorsteps. "There's a kind of grace in moving forward," she said, "even when you don't know where the path ends." One night, a group of pilgrims stopped outside your home. They saw your candle in the window and paused. One, an older man with dark sun-browned skin, touched his heart and whispered, "Grazie." You nodded from the window. He reached into his satchel and left a small object on your doorstep, a stone with a hole in the center, smooth and worn by river water. Your mother picked it up and placed it on the table. "A prayer stone," she said, "for safe crossing." You kept it beside your angel. That night, you dreamed of lanterns moving through fog, not lost, not frantic, just steady, the light swaying, the snow falling, and someone singing far ahead, a song without words, guiding them forward. By the middle of winter, Florence wore a different face, not the face of celebration, nor one of open sorrow. It was a face covered, veiled in silence, shaped by fear and the fragile desire for dignity. It began as necessity, a response to breath. It turned dangerous, to air turned suspect. And yet, as with so much else in the city, necessity gave way to meaning. The first masks were simple, cloth tied over the nose and mouth, soaked in rosewater or vinegar, laced with camphor or lavender. Apothecaries sold bundles of herbs to fold into the fabric. The wealthier fashioned coverings from imported silks or padded velvet, stitched with symbols of saints. Then came the masks of the physicians, their beaks curved long and hollow, filled with burning spices, dried flowers, and bitter roots. Their glass eyes stared unblinking, their voices emerged hollow. They moved like harbingers in the alleys, dressed in dark robes and gloves, each a figure of warning. You saw your first plague doctor at a distance, crossing the Piazza della Signoria in silence. A woman stepped back into the shadows as he passed. Children fell silent. Even the pigeons did not stir, but it didn't stop there. Soon the masks began to change. Not all were practical. Not all were made of cloth or meant to protect. They became something else. Ritual, resistance, remembrance. A way for the people of Florence to carry their grief without being devoured by it. You noticed one in the market, a man whose face was hidden behind a sunburst mask of painted wood. Another day, you saw a woman with a veil sewn with tiny stars and a crescent moon. Children wore masks shaped like birds or beasts, often adorned with sprigs of rosemary or feathers dipped in ash. Your mother called it la mascherata silenziosa, the quiet masquerade. At first, you thought she disapproved, but then she opened her sewing chest and drew out a bundle wrapped in old linen, bits of lace, coloured thread, silver beads, tiny ribbons pressed flat like dried flowers. "I kept these," she said softly, "from the last feast of San Giovanni, before the illness came." She held up a small mask, half-formed, its edges rough, but its shape already graceful. "I had meant it for you. You were too young then." You looked at it closely, white linen shaped like a bird's face, with soft, grey-stitched feathers along the sides and a place at the top for a single feather or flame. "Can I finish it?" you asked. She nodded. "With your own hands, it will say more." So that evening, under candlelight, the two of you worked in silence. She showed you how to fold the fabric, how to sew without puckering the edges. You stitched slowly, carefully, your fingers trembling slightly with the weight of it. When it was done, you tied it on and looked into the polished copper plate above the hearth. You did not look braver. You did not feel invincible, but somehow you felt steadier. "It doesn't hide you," your mother said. "It holds you." Your father said little, but the next day he brought in a piece of olive wood and began carving. By dusk, he had shaped a mask of his own, simple, with open eyes and a calm mouth, the brow lined like aged stone. That week, more people began to appear in the streets with masks not only for function, but for meaning. Some painted tears down the cheeks. Others stitched words into the edges, names, blessings, prayers in Latin or local dialect. One afternoon, outside the Church of Santa Croce, a boy handed you a paper mask painted with gold stars. "For the ones who can't dance anymore," he whispered. You placed it beside a statue of St. Cecilia, the patron of music, and left a sprig of sage beneath it. At night, you saw them from your window, small groups walking quietly beneath. The lanterns, each face transformed. The city, once so familiar, became a dreamscape. A procession of silent players moving through a play no one had scripted. But there was comfort in it. The masks allowed people to face the city again, to step outside, to grieve in public without being raw, to bless the dead without unraveling. Your mother wore hers once a week, to visit the herbalist's stand or leave bread by the convent gate. She never spoke of what she saw on those errands, but her hands always moved a little slower afterward. Your father began carving masks as offerings. Each evening, he left one near the chapel. Some were plain, others bore expressions, grief, serenity, awe. One had no face at all, just smooth, wood shaped like a droplet of water. Another had an open mouth with no eyes. He never signed them. "Let them be worn by whoever needs them," he said, "or seen." You began sketching them in your journal, a quiet catalogue of expressions too tender for words. You drew your own mask too, again and again, until it became not just an object, but a presence. One night, a procession passed your window, 30 masked figures carrying candles. They sang no hymn, but their steps were in perfect rhythm, and the light moved with them like breath. You didn't know who they were or where they were going, but you watched until the last flame disappeared into the dark. Afterward, you wrote another letter to the lost. To the ones behind the masks, you wrote, "We see you, even when we don't know your names. We carry you, in wood, in cloth, in flame." You tied it to the iron gate of the old schoolhouse, now closed and silent. Someone had hung 3 masks there already, and beside them a sign written in charcoal. Not all angels have wings. Some have ribbons. You touched it gently. That night you dreamt of a hall filled with masked figures, each holding a lantern, each turning slowly, as if listening for something distant and deep. A song just beyond hearing. You woke without fear. You understood now. The masks were not disguises. They were memory made visible. In Florence, feast days were once rivers of light and laughter. The bells rang louder, and the air filled with roasted chestnuts, figs soaked in honey, and the distant boom of drums echoing through piazzas. Ribbons fluttered from windows. Candles spilled their wax like gold down stone steps. The saints' statues were draped in silk, and children ran barefoot through petals scattered across the ground. But now, the feasts came in silence. You did not even know the day had arrived until the priest walked through the street, head bowed beneath a grey stole, whispering prayers to a saint whose name barely echoed anymore. "It is the feast of Saint Bibiana," your mother said, stirring a pot of lentils, patroness of those who suffer long illnesses. Your father nodded slowly. "I carved her once, years ago, pale hands, a palm branch in her grasp." You imagined the figure, thin, gentle, eyes like candlelight. "Why don't we celebrate?" you asked. Your mother answered without looking up. "Because this year, it feels too close." Still, the bells rang, not with joy, but with duty. The church remained open, but the pews were empty. Only candles and dust filled the nave, and the holy water had dried in its marble basin. Outside, a single banner hung, white linen with a faded red cross fluttering weakly in the cold wind. In the afternoon, your father invited you to walk. "I want to show you something," he said. You wrapped yourself in your cloak and followed him down the winding lane, past shuttered windows and crooked doors, past the old olive press and the fountain where moss now grew in the bowl. Near the convent of Santa Verdiana, a small courtyard opened up, a place once used for feast day gatherings. It was there your father stopped. You saw them then, plates of food, untouched, laid in quiet offerings upon the stone table. Simple things: bread, dried figs, onions wrapped in cloth, a sprig of bay, a pear. No meat, no wine, no laughter. Your father stepped aside and gestured toward the wall. On it hung a scroll pinned with black ribbon. "We eat," it read in careful script, "but not for joy. We eat to remember, for those who cannot, for those who wait, for those who are no longer hungry." It was signed by the sisters of the quiet table. Your father added your family's bread to the row. "It's what we would have eaten," he said. You watched him for a moment. He bowed his head, not like a carver or a laborer, but like a pilgrim. Then he turned to you. "We still feast, Matteo, just not in the way we once did. At home, you want..." Mother set the table with care. No ribbon, no flowers, only what you had: a bowl of lentils, dark and steaming, a heel of bread, an orange halved, and a candle in a cracked glass jar. Before eating, she said a short prayer, not one from the books, but from memory, for the hands that cannot hold the spoon, for the lips that no longer taste, for the songs that were meant to be sung today, but were swallowed. Then she nodded, and you ate. The food was simple, but it tasted different, richer, heavier, as if it carried the weight of what it replaced. That night, you stepped out into the street, candle in hand, and found others doing the same. Small flames burned on windowsills, on stoops, at the corners of fountains. No one spoke. But as you walked past one home, you heard humming, soft, unsure, but steady. A woman's voice singing a verse from an old feast day chant. "May joy return with morning light, when sorrow finds its end in night." You hummed it to yourself as you walked. Then you saw a figure, an old man placing dried fruit in a bowl at the statue of Saint Bibiana, which had been moved to the corner chapel. He touched the hem of her stone robe and whispered, "Eat with us." You watched, silent. When he left, you approached and added your own offering, a drawing you had made of a candle, small and imperfect, but bright. Later, at home, your mother, Told you stories of feast days from her youth. They used to dress the donkeys in ribbons, she said, smiling softly. And the baker's wife would sing to the bread. I once danced until my feet blistered. Were you happy? You asked. She paused. Yes, but it wasn't just joy. It was connection. You understood. Feast days were not only celebration. They were memory, community, defiance, a way of saying, we are still here. That night, you wrote another letter. To Saint Bibiana, you began. I don't know if you heard the bells today. They were soft, but they rang. I didn't dance, but I hummed. We ate without smiling, but we remembered. You folded it gently and placed it beneath your candle. You dreamt of a long table set in a field beneath a sky full of stars. People sat in silence. No feast, no fire, only presence. And slowly, across the table, hands began to reach for one another, not to grasp, but simply to touch. And in the distance, someone sang, not loudly, but clearly. It began with a scent, soft, green, and oddly warm for winter. You smelled it as you and your mother crossed the worn path behind the convent of Santa Verdiana. It rose through the air like memory itself, a mix of thyme and dried lavender, of rosemary just bruised beneath careful fingers. There was something alive in it, not loud, not blooming, but patient. She still tends it, your mother said, her breath curling like smoke, even now. You looked up at her. Who? She adjusted her shawl against the breeze. La Vedova Fiorita, the flowering widow. The name was familiar in the way that ghost stories are familiar. You had heard it whispered by merchants at wine, dusk, by a choir boy who said she spoke to the ground, by the herbalist before her door was marked, a widow who grew herbs that never withered, who talked to saints through soil, who once lost everything but still watered her garden at dawn. Your mother had not spoken of her before, but on that pale morning, with the city still wrapped in winter's grief, she took your hand and said it was time. She helped me once, before you were born, when I had forgotten how to hold hope. She helped me remember that grief could grow, things too. You walked together through frost-tipped grass and beneath olive trees whose bark was as cracked and scarred as old hands. Birds flitted between branches, quiet but not gone. The air was rich with the smell of earth, real earth, not city stone. The gate was made of driftwood and tied with twine. Ivy coiled through the cracks like veins. You didn't knock. Your mother simply pushed it open, slowly, reverently. And there she was. The widow stood at the far end of the garden, wrapped in layers of grey wool, her back slightly bent, her long white braid tucked beneath her scarf. She did not look up immediately. Her hands were deep in the dirt, patting something into place. Maybe a bulb, maybe a memory. The garden around her was alive in ways the rest of the world had forgotten. Even now, in the grip of cold, rosemary bushes stood green and firm. Clumps of parsley peeped through straw blankets. Calendula seeds slept in clay pots lined against the wall. Marjoram hung from beams like delicate prayer scrolls. When she did lift her head, her eyes were pale green and not surprised. You came, she said softly, not as a question, but a welcome. Your mother bowed her head, and you followed. It's time my son saw something still growing, your mother said. The widow smiled gently. Then he has already begun to heal. She gestured to a bench carved from an old barrel and motioned for you to sit. You did carefully, aware of the stillness that seemed to hum just beneath the soil. She walked the garden slowly, with your mother beside her. They didn't speak much. The widow would point. This is winter mint. This is feverfew sleeping beneath ash. This is where the lemon balm will return. Her fingers moved with certainty, with quiet ceremony. You watched, clutching your wool mittens, unsure of what to feel. Then she approached the center of the garden, where a bare tree stood. A fig tree, its trunk twisted but strong, Around its base, white stones formed a circle. Names were carved into them. Some were worn smooth, others still sharp. "These," the widow said without turning, "are my children, and my sisters, and my husband, and the boy who brought me. Lemons in the year the river froze." Your breath caught. She bent and placed a single bay leaf on one of the stones. Every planting begins with remembering. Then she stood and turned to you. "You've lost, haven't you?" she asked. Not cruelly, not even sadly, just truthfully. You nodded. She opened her palm and showed you a walnut shell, hollowed and filled with dried petals. "Smell," she said. You did. It was rose and something else, something like the wind through a cathedral. "When grief is too loud," she said, "carry this. It reminds you of the quiet things that survive." You took it gently. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," she replied. "Thank the soil. It never judges your tears." Your mother smiled faintly, her eyes damp. "She told me something once," she said, turning to you. "After my second loss, I was angry. I wanted to tear up my herb garden, but she said," the widow finished the sentence herself, "tear it if you must, but do it with your hands, not your heart. The earth forgives. It just asks to be touched again." You didn't speak on the way home. The wind had picked up, and the city looked different, less grey, more still, as if waiting for something small but certain. At home, your mother placed the jar of crushed thyme the widow had given her on the mantel. She burned a pinch of it that night. The smoke curled in slow spirals toward the ceiling. Your father listened as she spoke of the garden, the stones, the fig tree. "She plants memory," he said quietly, "and harvests mercy." You took the walnut shell to your room and placed it beside your angel. Then, on a piece of parchment, you drew what you could remember: the fig tree, the circle of names, the pale marjoram reaching toward the cold light. That night, you dreamed of green leaves growing through frost, of hands pressing bulbs into soil with reverence. You dreamed of a garden that sang, not loudly, but deeply, like a heart that had been broken and chosen to keep beating anyway. You woke, with the scent of rose still in your nose, and for the first time in many nights, you felt the world breathing again. It was the eve of Lent when the notice was posted, a single parchment nailed to the doors of every parish church in Florence. The script was careful, the ink smudged at the corners. It read only this: "The water has been drained. Ashes remain. Come if you must." At first you didn't understand, but your mother did. She read it once, then folded her apron quietly and said, "They've emptied the fonts, the baptismal fonts, once filled with holy water, clear and cold, touched by countless fingers, brushed across brows and chests, a circle of grace at every threshold, now emptied, not as punishment, but because the water had been still too long, because too many hands had vanished after touching it, and in their place, ash." You walked with your mother the next morning, down the hill to the church of San Remigio. The sky was grey, but not cruel. The bells did not ring. Only the door creaked as it opened, as though the building itself had not spoken in some time. Inside, the candles flickered. The air was dry with incense, the faint scent of frankincense clinging to the walls. The pews were mostly empty, save for a few figures sitting motionless, heads bowed, hands clasped, as if holding something fragile and invisible. The font stood near the entrance, a basin of white marble, carved with vines and cherubs, its basin wide and open. But now, no water glimmered in its belly. Instead, a small mound of ashes sat at its center, black and soft as soot, ringed with rosemary and dried bay leaves. People came one by one. They didn't dip their fingers, as they once would have. Instead, they took a pinch of ash between thumb and forefinger, then pressed it to their chests. Some left a lock of hair. Others whispered names. It was not a rite of baptism. It was a rite of remembering. Your mother stepped forward. She knelt beside the font and held a small cloth bundle. Inside, the last sprig of lavender from her wedding crown. She placed it gently beside the ashes, then traced a small cross over her heart. "For what could not be held," she whispered. Then she stepped aside. You approached slowly, unsure. The ash looked so fragile. And yet, there was something in it that felt vast, like time itself had been ground down and gathered here. You thought of the river, of the letters tied to the gates, of the names carved in the widow's garden stones. You thought of every goodbye not spoken, and then, without knowing quite why, you placed your drawing into the font, folded and small, the one of your angel, your walnut shell, your father's. Lanterns. You tucked it beside the ashes and pressed your fingers to your chest. "I remember," you whispered. Later, you and your mother sat in one of the side pews. You watched as others came, quietly, steadily. A young man with bandaged hands, a nun with white hair, a father carrying a child too still in his arms. No one sang, no one preached. But the church breathed again. Then the priest came forward, not in his usual vestments, but in plain robes, the colour of the stone around him. He carried no book, only a small bowl of oil and a wooden cross. He said only this: "From ashes we do not only come. From ashes we write the names of the lost." Then he anointed each person, not with water, but with a small circle of oil at the centre of the forehead. You felt the warmth of it as he touched you. Your mother wept, not loudly, but the kind of tears that come when grief is no longer a stranger, but a companion. Afterwards, as the congregation slowly dispersed, the priest placed a linen cloth over the font, but he left the ashes inside. "Tomorrow," he said, "we return to prayer, but today we dwell with the memory." On the walk home, you said nothing for a long time. Finally, you asked, "Why ashes?" Your mother looked ahead, her eyes on the hills. "Because they are what's left when the fire has passed," she said. "But they're not empty. Ashes are what the earth uses to begin again." That night, your father set a bowl by the hearth. Inside, he placed a pinch of incense ash, mixed with olive oil and crushed thyme. Then he lit a candle beside it. "For the ones who no longer knock," he said. And you understood. Not all rituals needed permission. Not all remembering required a priest. Sometimes it was enough to sit with the ash, to breathe, to let the silence carry their names. You added a stone to the bowl, small, smooth, from the path behind the convent, and beside it, the dried rose petal from your walnut shell. You watched the flame flicker. You wrote that night, not a letter, but a list of names. Some you knew, some you did not. Some were only gestures. The woman with the dove mask, the child in the lavender shawl, the man who sang near the fountain, you did not want to forget. The next morning the church bells rang again, but now you heard them differently, not as calls to duty or sorrow, but as a voice rising, through ash soft but certain. The dream began with footsteps, soft, deliberate, like bare soles pressing gently upon old stone. You did not see the figure at first, only the sound, echoing faintly through the corridors of sleep. The air was thick with mist, and the walls around you pulsed with the dim glow of candlelight. It felt like the inside of a chapel, but one you had never visited. The scent was familiar. Beeswax, thyme, and something older, something like memory warmed by sun. Then she appeared. She was veiled in grey, her robe simple, her feet bare. Her eyes were not visible beneath the shadow of her hood, yet you felt them, calm and watchful, like a tide that knows its rhythm. In one hand, she carried a staff shaped like a branch. In the other, she held a small wooden box. You were not afraid. Even in the hush of that strange space, even though her face remained hidden, you felt safe. She knelt before you and opened the box. Inside were things that stirred your heart before. Your mind could name them. A sprig of sage, a carving of a dove, a scrap of parchment with a single word, patience. She said nothing, only pressed her palm to your forehead and closed the box again. When you awoke, the scent of sage still lingered. You told your mother at breakfast. She paused over the bread and looked toward the window. I know her, she said softly. Or I think I do. My grandmother once spoke of a saint who never appears in paintings, not because she is unknown, but because she walks in dreams. Is she real? You asked. Some saints live in books, your mother replied. Others live in moments. She may be one of those. That day, your father carved a new figure, without a face. He said it came to him while sleeping, though he could not recall the dream. He gave it a small staff and left the hands open. When you saw it, your breath caught. It was her. She came to me too, you whispered. He didn't question it, only nodded. She has no name, you said. Your mother smiled faintly. Then you may be the one to give it. That night, you placed the faceless saint beside your angel and whispered, I will call you Speranza, hope. The next dream came, 3 nights later. This time, you were walking a path of river stones, and the sky was neither day nor night. She walked beside you, still veiled, still silent. But as you passed small pools of water along the way, images surfaced. Your choir, Master, Brother Leone, standing in an empty nave and singing alone. The herbalist's jars, untouched and dusty. The widow tending a single violet in the frost. Each one shimmered, then faded. Finally, she stopped and placed a hand on your shoulder. You turned to face her. From beneath her veil, a single tear slipped, down. Silver, not of sorrow, but of memory. And then you woke. You did not speak of this dream right away. It lived in you, quietly, like a soft song carried in the back of your mind. You drew her again and again, first with charcoal, then in wax. Always faceless, always walking. Soon, others began to dream of her too. You heard the whispers at the market, a weaver said. She saw a veiled woman standing in the doorway of her workshop, only to vanish when she blinked. A nun confessed that during night prayers, a figure had knelt beside her and left behind a carved wooden dove. In the chapel of St. Cecilia, someone had pinned a note. She walks with us in silence. Her staff touches the earth. Her breath is mercy. No one claimed authorship, but all felt her presence. The priest at San Remigio gave her a name in his sermon, Santa Inson, the sleepless saint. For she keeps watch when we cannot, and in dreams, she lays her hands upon the broken. He placed a bowl of river stones near the altar, inviting anyone to leave a name. Not for death, he said, but for remembrance. You placed your drawing in the bowl. That evening, your mother wove a small ribbon of grey and tied it around your wrist. For when she visits again, she said, so you'll know her touch. And she did. One final time. In this dream, the city was quiet, not empty, but stilled. You stood on the bridge, the river below gleaming like ink. She stood at the far end, facing away. When you called her name, Speranza, she turned. But this time, there was no veil. Her face was not one you knew. And yet, you did. It was your mother's eyes, your father's brow, your own nose, slightly crooked, the face of every soul who had chosen to endure. She smiled, and in her hands, she held the wooden box again. She opened it once more, but now, inside, there was a flame. She placed it in your palms and vanished. You woke in darkness, but you were not afraid. You held your hands before you, and though nothing was there, you felt the warmth. The candle was nearly gone when you had the idea. It had burned through many nights, its flame steady beside your angel and the faceless saint. Wax had pooled around its base, melted and hardened into strange shapes, ridges like hills, valleys, and rivers of pale gold. You traced them with your finger and wondered why the shapes felt familiar. "It's like a map," you whispered. The thought came not as imagination, but as certainty. And once you saw it that way, you couldn't unsee it. The wax had curved into a slope that resembled the hill behind the convent. Another ledge looked like the bend of the Arno just before the bridge. A small dip reminded you of the window ledge where your mother placed bread for the birds. It wasn't a real map, not one that could guide soldiers or pilgrims, but it was yours, a map of memory. The next morning, you asked your mother if you could help her with the candles. She raised an eyebrow, then smiled. "It's time," she said. "You've watched long enough." You spent the day learning how to melt the beeswax slowly over low flame, how to strain it through cloth to catch bits of bark or old wick. You learned to scent it with rosemary and orange peel, and how to dip the wick carefully again and again to build the candle's body. Your hands grew steady, your mind too. That evening, you poured your first mould. Not round, but square, like the stone tiles in the cathedral. You pressed small leaves into the wax before it cooled, and etched a mark on each side before it hardened. A river, a tear, a star, and a flame. You placed it on your table and stared at it long into the night. Each morning that followed, you made another. Soon, your table held a quiet collection of candles, none meant for lighting, all meant for remembering. Each was a place, or a feeling, or a name. You carved small symbols into the wax, an open hand, a closed eye, the outline of a bird. You called it your mappa di luce, your map of light. When your father saw it, he said, "This is more than craft. This is prayer." You nodded. Your mother began collecting scraps for you, wicks too short for use, bits of broken honeycomb, the heel of a cinnamon stick. Each item added a scent or a texture to the next piece. One afternoon, she handed you a thin piece of parchment. It was a drawing from her own youth, a map of her village before she moved to Florence. She pointed to a circle. "That was the tree where I first kissed your father." You laughed, then traced the shape onto your next candle. Piece by piece, your map grew, but it was not meant to be whole. You never planned to lay it out on a table and follow it like a path. It was not a trail, it was a remembering, a gathering. Each candle a small fire in the dark corners of your memory. Others began to notice. One day, Brother Leone visited to bring choir parchment and saw the candles lined neatly on the window ledge. "Whose work is this?" he asked. "Mine," you said. He studied them for a long time. "This one," he said, pointing to a stub shaped like a keyhole, "feels like confession." You nodded. "I made it the night after I saw the pilgrims pass." He lit a candle. "In your home chapel that evening and left behind a simple note. You are mapping grief into grace." You didn't respond, but you carved his name into the bottom of your next piece. Then, something changed. Your mother lit one of your candles, not one of the display ones, but one marked with an eye and a river. It was your most quiet piece, the one you had made the night after dreaming of Saint Speranza for the last time. She said nothing as it burned, just watched, and after it had melted down to a pool, she used a spoon to pour some of the liquid into a small clay cup. "For the next one," she said, "wax, reborn." In that moment, you understood something deeper. The map was not static. It shifted, melted, changed, like grief, like memory, like the city itself. You began giving your candles away, quietly, one to the widow who placed it beneath her fig tree, one to the man who still played his lute beside the empty fountain, One to a woman who had stopped writing letters to the lost, but still walked the market in silence. Each candle found its place, and you never asked what they did with them. You didn't need to. You made them and let them go. One evening, as snow began to fall again in small, lazy flakes, your father placed one of your candles in the chapel's Madonna niche. It was shaped like a simple heart, but cracked slightly on one side. He lit it, then placed his carving knife beside it. "For what I cannot say in stone," he whispered. That night, you dreamed of Saint Speranza again, not walking, not speaking, but sitting beside a map made of wax, her hands smoothing the softened paths, her breath melting sorrow into rivers. You woke with tears on your cheeks, but not from sadness, from gratitude. You had found a way to carry them all, in flame, in scent, in softened wax, in light. The choir had been silent for many weeks. Brother Leone had closed the chapel to rehearsals when the sickness returned in early spring, its breath clinging to the skin of the city like a second, invisible rain. The streets grew sparse again. Doors stayed bolted, and even the pigeons seemed to avoid the arches of the cloister. But the music had not vanished. It lived in the walls, in the stones, in memory. You still hummed it, sometimes while shaping wax, sometimes beneath your breath when, placing a new candle on the sill, the melodies came unbidden, as if they remembered you better than you remembered them. One afternoon, as you were returning from the herbal stand with a pouch of lemon balm, you heard it, soft, tentative. A single voice. The chapel door had been left slightly ajar, and from within came the unmistakable sound of Pietro, the freckled boy with the voice like wind on high stone. You paused in the shadows, not wanting to interrupt. He was singing a hymn you'd once practiced together. It had been meant for Easter, song of rising, but never sung in public. Now his voice trembled through the chapel's dim interior, like a prayer too long held. You stepped inside. The space looked the same, but emptier. Dust motes danced in the light from the high windows. The benches, though polished, bore the hush of abandonment. At the front stood Brother Leone, silent, eyes closed, listening. When Pietro's voice faded, the chapel did not echo. It held the silence like a secret. Then Brother Leone turned. "You remember it?" he asked gently. You nodded. "I do." He gestured to the choir stall. "Then sit." And so, without ceremony, you did. One by one, others came. Clara, now taller, her braids longer. Niccolo with a tremble in his hands but his pitch steady. 3 others you hadn't seen in months. No announcements, no practice sheets, just presence. That afternoon, the choir was reborn, not in triumph, but in stillness. You did not sing loudly. The songs were not joyous. They were shaped like sighs, like lullabies sung beside sickbeds, like stories told with half a voice. Brother Leone led you in plainsong, simple chants in Latin, slow and circular, like footsteps returning to the beginning. Ubi caritas et amor, Deus ibi est. Where charity and love are, there is God. You didn't know if God was still listening, but you knew the notes found you. The choir began meeting every few days, not to perform, but to remember. Each session was part song, part silence, part sigh. You sang for the ones who didn't return, for the families that left without word, for the voices that would never rise again. Brother Leone called it the vigil of breath. "Every note," he said one morning, "is an offering. We do not need ears to receive them, only hearts." You carved those words into wax that night, on a candle shaped like a lyre. You lit it and let it burn through dusk. Soon, word of the music spread. People didn't come to watch. You never performed. But they would pause outside the chapel and sit along the wall, heads bowed. You saw tears sometimes. You saw smiles, faint and flickering like candlelight. Once, a woman placed a dried flower on the chapel step with a note. Your song held my son's name. You never knew who she was, but you carved a flower into your next candle. One afternoon, Brother Leone asked each of you to bring a sound that reminded you of someone you had lost. Not a song, a sound. You thought long, then you brought a wax-covered string you had once stretched on a frame to tune notes. It had snapped during a thunderstorm, the night the chalk appeared on your friend's door. You played it gently, just once. The others brought wooden spoons, the clink of beads, the hum of wind in a bottle. Together, you created a song not of melody, but of memory. And it was more beautiful than anything you had sung before. Brother Leone stood, his voice shaking, and whispered, "This is what it means to remain." Music returned to your home. Your mother sang again while grinding herbs. Not every day, but often. Your father hummed as he carved, an old mountain song you had never heard. You added notes to your wax map, symbols of sound, a bell, a bird, a lyre, a breath. Even the city changed. A fiddler returned to the market square, playing to pigeons and silence. Someone tied bells to a cart and let them ring as they walked through the alleys. Children clapped a rhythm as they skipped, 3 beats, then pause. It was not joyous music, but it was music. It meant we are still here. That night you wrote a letter, not to the lost, but to the song itself. You waited, you wrote. Even when we were silent, you stayed near. You whispered through the cracks and sang in dreams. I will not leave you behind. You folded the letter and placed it beneath the lyre-shaped candle. Then you sang the lullaby your mother taught you, quietly into the stillness. Not because you were strong, but because the music had waited long enough. It began with a single thread, drawn carefully through the edge of a frayed linen sleeve. Your mother sat by the window, the last light of day catching the silver in her hair. Her fingers moved in slow rhythm, needle flashing briefly in the dusk. She was mending one of your father's work shirts, worn thin along the elbows, where stone dust had settled over months of use. But she wasn't just stitching. You watched as she paused after each pass of the needle, murmuring a name beneath. Her breath, Tommaso, Clara's uncle, the woman from the olive stall. You sat beside her, hands folded. Are you praying? You asked. She nodded. Each stitch is a word. You didn't speak for a while. Outside, the evening bell rang from the convent tower. One tone, long and hollow, echoing across the rooftops like a sigh. When the shirt was mended, she folded it neatly and placed it atop a small basket. Then she reached inside and drew out another piece of cloth. Not a garment this time, but a square of linen, pale and soft, the kind once used to wrap newborns or line bread baskets. I used to do this as a girl, she said, handing you a needle. When the world was too loud to speak, we stitched instead. You hesitated, unsure. But then she showed you, a simple X sewn at the corner. She tied off the thread and handed the cloth to you. Your turn. You held the needle clumsily. At first, fingers unsure, the linen trembling beneath your touch. But slowly, with her guidance, the thread obeyed. You stitched a single curve, a shape like a crescent, or a smile. Who is that for? She asked gently. You thought for a moment. The man with the lantern, you said. The one who gave us the river stone. She nodded and tied off your thread. That night, you dreamed of hands, hands weaving, stitching, folding. A tapestry made not of colours but of names, each name a knot, each knot a prayer. When you woke, your hands ached, but the linen lay beside, you soft and steady. In the days that followed, the basket grew. You and your mother stitched quietly, without pressure, without goal. Some cloths bore symbols, stars, leaves, birds. Others held only lines. but each was sewn with intention, with breath, with memory. Soon, your father added his own contribution, not stitching, but carving small wooden buttons from olive wood and plum. Each button bore a symbol, a flame, a drop of water, a grain of wheat. He sewed them gently onto the cloths you completed. These, he said, are our constellations. Word spread. Others began stitching too. The widow from the garden sent bundles of herb-scented linen wrapped in dried bay leaves. The choir left small cloths on the chapel benches, hymns written in needle and thread. Even Brother Leone tried, his stitches uneven but earnest. Each cloth was folded and tied with string. You stored them in a chest beneath your bed, adding lavender to keep the moths away. Your mother said, "One day we'll hang them." "Where?" you asked. She smiled. "Where the wind can find them." That day came sooner than expected. It was the first true day of spring. The air smelled of earth, and the snow had melted from the roof tiles. Your father suggested a walk, not to the city this time, but to the hills beyond, where the trees were just beginning to bud. You carried the chest between you. When you reached the ridge above the vineyard, you saw it, the old oak tree, gnarled and strong, its branches bare but wide. Beneath it stood a crumbling stone wall, and behind it, a meadow. "We'll hang them here," your mother said. Your father brought twine and small wooden clothespins. One by one, you unfolded the prayer cloths and hung them from the branches and between stones. The wind picked at them gently, fluttering the corners, lifting the stitches into motion. Some bore names, others symbols. But together, they looked like a sky, woven from sorrow, stitched with grace. Passers-by began to stop. Traveller knelt and added a blue ribbon. A child touched a stitched sun and whispered, "My brother." A woman laid a stone at the base of the tree and bowed. You left a candle from your wax map beneath the branches. The cloths danced in the breeze. That night, at home, your mother handed you a new square of linen, pure white, untouched. "For what comes next?" she said. You stared at it, uncertain. "I don't know what shape to make," you admitted. She placed a hand on your shoulder. "Then let it be empty. Sometimes silence is the holiest prayer." You placed it at the top of the chest, unstitched but not forgotten. That evening, as the sun dipped low, you returned alone to the tree. The cloth swayed above you like wings, soft and full of memory. The wind carried their threads skyward, and you sat beneath them, listening, not to the past, but to the prayers still being sown into the world. It came softly, not with fevered cries or sudden collapse, not with blood or boils, only with silence. One morning, as the light crept gently through the shutters and the first sounds of pigeons stirred the city to waking, your father did not rise. You noticed first the absence. No sound of wood being split in the courtyard. No quiet hum of a hymn drifting from the workshop. The chisels remained untouched on the table, their edges clean, their silence complete. You found him sitting at the edge of his bed, already dressed, his posture upright, but his face distant, as though he were listening to something only he could hear. Your mother appeared in the doorway a moment later, her eyes narrowing with gentle concern. She crossed the room and placed her hand on his brow. He did not flinch. "I think," he said quietly, "that I am slowing down." It was all he needed to say. Your mother said nothing. She simply held his hand for a long time, then pressed her cheek to his knuckles. You watched from the hallway, the stillness around you folding in like linen drawn over a flame. By midday, he had lain down, not in exhaustion, but as one returns to a place they know they will not leave. Your mother moved with practiced grace. The herbs were gathered, the old cloths warmed. A sprig of dried mint hung at the window, tied with a white ribbon. She lit the Madonna candle, the one you had carved with him long ago, and placed it near his head. You knelt beside the bed. He looked at you with the same eyes that had once taught you how to hold a chisel. They were softer now, as if shaped not by stone, but by wind. "I am not afraid," he said. You believed him. Each day after that became a quiet ritual. Your mother brewed tea from quince and thyme. She dipped cloths in vinegar and rosemary and wiped his forehead. You read to him from his prayer book, not the formal chapters, but the pages tucked in the back. Notes in his own hand, verses half remembered from his childhood. "Sing for me," he asked once, and so you did. You sang the lullaby your mother had once taught you, the one with no chorus and no end. He smiled. His lips moved, but no sound came. "I sang that to you once," he whispered, "when you were too small to remember." You held his hand. His breath grew shallower with each day, yet his presence never faded. It only became quieter, deeper, like a river running beneath stone. On the third day, he called for his tools. You brought them, wrapped in cloth, smelling faintly of oil and cedar. His fingers trembled as he opened the bundle. He touched each one with reverence. Then he handed one to you, a worn chisel with a split in the handle. "This one has known more than I have," he said. "Keep it, not to use, but to remember." You pressed it to your chest. That night, your mother slept beside him, her hand resting on his. You remained at the foot of the bed, watching the candlelight dance across his brow, each flicker casting gentle shadows on the wall. In your lap lay a blank cloth, the one you had never stitched. You picked up the needle, and you began. The first mark was a curved line, like the bend in the Arno where he once showed you how the water turns slowly in spring. The second was a single star, small, quiet, set just above the line. The third was an open hand. You did not rush. Each stitch was a breath, each breath a farewell. In the final hours, he stirred only once. Your mother cradled his face. "Girolamo," she whispered, voice trembling. "Do you see the light?" He opened his eyes, and for a moment they shone, not with strength, but with peace. "I see the river," he said, "and the Madonna with her hands open." His eyes closed again, and then no more. The silence that followed was not hollow, it was full, like a room filled with remembered song. Your mother kissed his forehead and lit the second candle, your candle. "For the ones who go before us," she whispered. You stood still. Then slowly, you folded the cloth you had sewn and placed it on his chest. Later, the choir came, not to sing, but to hum a tone so soft, it blended with the sound of wind through the shutters. Brother Leone sprinkled bay leaves and lavender across the floor and murmured psalms beneath his breath. They washed your father's body in warm water and rosemary oil. They wrapped him in the linen he had worn on your mother's wedding day. Your mother placed his chisel beside him. You added the stone angel. No one spoke of death, only of return. That night, you did not dream. But when you woke, the sun was rising. The pigeons stirred on the rooftop. The bells of Santa Croce rang softly in the distance. You stood at the window and whispered, "You are the silence that stays, and the hands that still guide." The wind carried your words through the streets, into alleys, over rooftops, and you knew he had not left. He had only changed form. Florence had not survived untouched. Its arches still bore soot where candles once wept into stone. Its cloisters whispered of names no longer spoken aloud. And in its marketplaces, voices carried just a breath quieter, as though the walls themselves remembered too much. But it had survived, not as it was, but as it must. Spring arrived, not in a parade of colour, but in a slow unfolding, like a letter, long delayed, creased at the corners, yet tender in its delivery. Olive trees budded once more, their branches curling gently into new life. The river, long choked by silence, now flowed with a soft voice again. Fishermen returned, birds returned, people returned, and with them, song. It was not the music of festivals or pageants, it was the hum of bread being kneaded at dawn, laughter of children skipping between stalls, the murmur of vendors offering olives and oranges again. In time, the chalk faded from the doors. The grief did not disappear, but it softened. It folded itself into the fabric of daily life, no longer tearing at the seams. The city had learned how to carry sorrow, how to live with it, not beneath it. You too had changed. You were not older in years, but in weight. The wax map you had built over the long winter now glowed in a soft procession across your shelf. Each candle remained unlit. You had decided they would not burn. They were not made for fire, but for memory. Your father's tools rested in their linen wrap, untouched since the day you had cleaned them last. Sometimes, in the hush before dusk, you would sit beside them and run your fingers along the cloth, not opening it, not speaking, just sitting. Your mother continued her stitching. Each week, she made a new prayer cloth, choosing her threads carefully. She had begun teaching others, 3 widows from the North Quarter, 2 girls from the choir. They gathered in the courtyard. On Tuesdays, their fingers moving with quiet reverence. You helped hang the finished pieces beneath the old oak tree. The limbs were full now, cloths like feathers, fluttering, whispering. Some had begun to fade, others were fresh, their colours still bold against the wind. Travellers stopped to tie their own. A merchant from Siena left a ribbon embroidered with a single dove. A midwife from Lucca added a square stitched with a line of poetry you couldn't, read but felt in your chest. A child left a drawing, a simple house with smoke curling up into the sky. The tree became a cathedral, not in stone or grandeur, but in breath, in remembrance, in love. One afternoon, you returned to the bridge, the place where you had once stood with a letter in your hand and no voice in your throat. The river ran clear now. You leaned over the stone rail and watched the water move beneath you, not fast, but sure. It flowed around the pillars like time itself, carrying what had been, what was, and what might still be. You pulled from your satchel a candle, the one shaped like a river stone. You had carved your father's name into the base. You placed it on the ledge, lit it, and stood beside it until the flame danced high and steady. You did not cry. You simply whispered, "Thank you," and walked on. That evening, the choir sang again, not in procession, not in audience, but in the chapel where it had all begun. The faces around you were different now, some familiar, some new, but every voice was soft. Every voice belonged. Brother. Leone opened the hymn book and did not direct. He sang with you, not above you. The music rose like mist and wrapped around the candlelight. You closed your eyes and sang the hymn your father loved. The one with no refrain, only verses that looped like a river back upon itself. When the final note faded, there was no applause, only breath. Peaceful. Whole. You walked home alone that night, through alleys that no longer frightened you, past windows now lit with the golden glow of evening kitchens, past shutters half open, where voices read aloud to children. You turned onto your street and saw your mother in the doorway, stitching beneath a lantern. She looked up, and in her eyes was no sorrow, only warmth. Behind her, the angel still stood upon the shelf. Beside it, the faceless saint, the walnut shell, the wooden chisel, the drawing of the garden. A city in miniature, carved from grief, rebuilt in love. You stepped inside and took your place at the table. Your mother poured warm water with lemon and clove. You added a sprig of fennel, and for the first time in many weeks, you laughed. It was not loud, but it was enough. Before bed, you wrote one final letter, not to the river, not to the saints, but to the city itself. Dear Firenze, you are the song that stayed, the candle that did not go out. You held us, you hurt with us, and you still breathe beneath these stones. We are changed, but not lost. We walk now with quieter feet, but our hearts burn steady. You are the city that remains, and I remain with you. You folded the letter and placed it beneath your pillow. And when you closed your eyes, the wind came again. Through the shutters, past the candle, across your brow, carrying with it a single word: peace.